Today, April 10th, marks day one in the Chad Daybell trial, a day we've anticipated for so long and for so many years. We started off with opening statements from both the prosecution and the defense. There was one witness on the stand for the day, and of course, some surprises sprinkled throughout. I live streamed the process as well and hung out with the crew. I'm Linda with It's a Crime, so now let's get into it. Right off the bat, we have to talk about the audio and the visual. The audio is so very bad to the point where we have it right at the top of the volume and you can't hear anything else, and it is pretty frustrating. Even when both the prosecution and defense did their opening statements, it was really still hard to hear. I do hope that they remedy this. It's really, really bad. Right at the beginning of the day, Lindsay Blake announced something and said that victims have a right to be here and sit in the room. And I remember in Lori's trial, the defense attorney didn't want some of the victims in the gallery, even made a huge uproar about not deeming Kay and Larry as the grandparents. It was I feel like it was day one. But the trial was supposed to start at 8:30 a.m. this morning, but it didn't start until 9. By the time jury instructions were all finished, it was 9:38 before even opening statements hit. Now, Prosecutor Rob Wood started off, and he also had a PowerPoint presentation. His opening line was, "Two dead children buried in the defendant's backyard." And he talked about the next month after that, Chad's wife would be found dead in the bed. And 17 days after that, Chad was laughing and dancing on a beach at his own wedding. And he summed it up as 3 dead bodies. And those lines were very powerful, I thought. Let me know what you think about that. Now, Rob talked about the desire for sex, money, and power. We heard that in Lori Daybell's trial. Now, one of the things that I really liked about Rob's presentation was how he mentioned Chad being an author, and that when he did his presentation, he outlined it so that he was speaking in chapters. So he said, chapter 1, Chad is just an ordinary man craving significance. He talked about him going on to do a publishing company and that Tammy worked as a librarian. In chapter 2, he called Lori a homemaker, which I thought was interesting. A lot of people in my live stream, in the chat, they didn't like that too much that Rob said that, but in my mind, as soon as he said homemaker, I thought right away of home wrecker. That would probably be more appropriate. He went on and talked about Tylee and JJ, and then the affair happened, and mentioned briefly about text messages, the exchanges, without going into any detail, just like Tylee and JJ. He said that Chad had a thirst for sex and that they had an alternate reality, as he and Lori claimed to be James and Elena. In chapter 3, he talked about Chad and how he dehumanized his victims, that he did castings to ward off evil in the victims, which we have heard of in the past. And he mentioned Alex Cox being Lori's brother and protector, and how he received spiritual rewards for doing things. And in my mind, it just goes to show really just how insecure Alex would have been, in my opinion, to believe all of this and, go forward in the plans, so to speak. But Alex was known to do anything for Lori. Many had chitter-chatter that it was quite an inappropriate relationship. But Rob didn't mention that, of course. But Rob talked about a blessing that Alex earned to be a member of the exclusive group. And that's what Chad told him. And that he assisted in ways for Chad and Lori that could never be repaid. Chapter 4, he talked about Lori receiving illegal Social Security benefits because she continued to receive them after Tylee died. He talked about Tammy Daybell and how she was deemed a dark spirit and shot at. In fact, Tylee was deemed a zombie, so was JJ, and so was Tammy, but he didn't use the term zombie yet. He talked about chapter 5, that 17 days after Tammy's death, there was a wedding that was prepared well before Tammy died. He said that Lori refused to also produce the children when they were reported missing. And then he talked about the raccoon text, which we know was sent the day that Tylee was buried. And that was about shooting a raccoon that was on the fence. He shot it with his gun and needed to burn the limb debris and buried in the pet cemetery. And again, Chad likes to use these play on words, as Tylee was dismembered and he needed to burn the limb debris. Now, Rob briefly went on through the timeline of events, and he mentioned that there will be a forensic accountant testifying. Rob briefly talked about DNA of Tylee being on 2 tools in Chad's shed and digital data, and we know that to be the pickaxe and shovel, but he didn't go in detail about it. He ended his opening statement just like he started. 2 dead children buried in the defendant's backyard. His wife found dead in their bed, and 17 days later, they were married. Then it was John Pryor's turn, and he talked about facts and evidence. He emphasized that's what's important, to focus on the facts and the evidence in all of this and don't be distracted. He went into talking about Chad and how when Chad was younger, he went on a mission in New Jersey, and then when he returned, he met Tammy Daybell. He talked about how they had an extended engagement and then moved to Utah. He said they ended up having 5 children together and then moved to Idaho, and called Tammy Daybell predominantly the brains of the company, which she did do a lot for the company. But I do find it interesting that he is doing that, because I feel it's more that he obviously wants to point to Lori also being the brains behind the operation. You know what I mean? If you agree, put heck yeah in the comments below and let me know what you think. He talked about Chad writing books and having certain beliefs, and that Chad did a series of books and also children's books and teenage books, and that Chad had premonitions, and he even mentioned dark and light, which was interesting that he brought that up, but not of course, in detail. But he said Chad believed in the coming to end of things. He didn't talk about anything further than that, but just Chad believing that there would be a coming to an end of things, as he worded it. He said that his books are based on fiction, but Chad himself says that even though it is fiction, and this is not John saying it, this is me saying it, that even though it's fiction, that all of the events are real, and his beliefs are real. And Chad said that, I believe it was on his website and in his books. And then John talked about Lori meeting Chad in October of 2018, and that Chad was invited to speak at a seminar, and he met Lori. And John says that Lori pursued Chad, and that Lori was helping sell Chad's books and helped him out, and that John nonchalantly threw in about Chad only having a speeding ticket. This was random back in 2005, which is interesting. He obviously had to chuck that in there, but the way he made it sound obviously was like it was all Lori and not Chad in any of this. But you know, it kind of takes two, especially with his storm being involved. Now, in actuality, Lori and Chad were fooling around the very first time they met. And Chad actually told Lori that they met in a previous lifetime and that they were married, and he was hitting on her too. So there's more to that than, that it was just Lori. I've done a ton of videos on all that. You could check it out. But then John decided to focus on Lori's many marriages, and she's been married 5 times. But he talked about Lori's marriage number 1, which was short-lived, he said. Number 2 was short-lived. He talked about Lori's brother Alex being her protector, and he would do anything and everything for her, which we've heard, and that is true. Number 3 husband he talked about, who was Joseph Ryan, and he said that there were terrible accusations about Joseph toward Tylee, and even we've heard in the past about it being towards Tylee's brother Colby as well, but he didn't mention that in there. He just said back in 2007, this is when Alex tased Joseph Ryan. So John made it known that, back in 2007, that Chad didn't even know Lori existed, and Alex was charged with aggravated assault, and he went to jail for a short time. He said that it sets the pattern with Alex, that he comes to the rescue and he runs to save Lori. Lori. But interestingly, and I quote, he said, it turned into an inappropriate relationship, which very much minimizes is that it was because Chad was cheating on Tammy for a year. Now, John went through the Charles Vallow case briefly and touched a little bit about it and said that Chad had nothing to do with the execution of Charles Vallow and that Alex is the one that shot him, which is true about Alex, but he called Lori vivacious and sexual and manipulative, and that she drove Chad into the relationship. You can't drive one person, like not one person. It takes two. So this is interesting. I'm so curious what the jurors are thinking at this point. He goes on to say about the current case. He says, yes, there was a murder and there was a burial. And he talked about how Chad owns 4.5 acres. And, on Chad's farm, there was a tree where JJ was found near an irrigation pond. He talked about there once being a raspberry patch over where the animals or pets were buried. And he brought up this raspberry patch a lot, it seems. I wonder how that's going to show up in the trial and how he's going to keep talking about this raspberry patch. Very interesting. I grew up with raspberry bushes, so this is going to be interesting what he says. We'll see. He talked about that there's going to be 4 experts. There's going to be a doctor who's a DNA expert, and that he's the go-to guy, and mentioned a fingerprint that was found on the plastic that JJ was wrapped in, and that it was Alex's, and a hair sample of Lori's, and several hair samples, he said. Then he talked about a forensic pathologist for Tammy. And then this next bit, I find a little bit of a head scratcher, because he says that there was no indication of a homicide of Tammy, and that they can't determine the cause of death. Which is what? We know that she died from asphyxia. From my understanding, there were bruises that suggested she was pinned down, and she died in bed, and she was also posed, which was proved. He continued on and on about Tammy, about, not being able to determine the cause of death, and how she used various medicinal treatments, he said, and oils and herbs, and refused to see a doctor, which we heard that narrative from Chad, and he was talking about how she had heart issues and it was failing her, and he, she went to bed with a bad cough and just passed away peacefully. So it's just interesting, though, also how Chad uses some of Tammy's side effects of the medication she was taking to match some of the possibilities, in my opinion. Now, John then focuses on the property and in on Alex visiting Chad's property, that Alex is the one who went there 5 to 6 times. The interesting thing, though, is Alex's phone pings. I think the most time he was there was 17 minutes in length, so it's pretty hard to dig a grave that quick, especially if it was Alex doing it. So that's going to be what really gets Chad, in my opinion, will be about those graves, and both graves that the children were buried in, and the methods that were used. And JJ's was said to have been quite meticulous. We heard that in Lori Daybell's trial, so we haven't heard that yet here, but it's going to be interesting aspect. And he talked a little bit about a vault in the trial. Lori's trial. So it'll be interesting here how that relates back to Chad. I'm sure we'll hear a lot of John yapping on that. Also, it was said that there's a forensic anthropologist who will be talking about the nature of the remains of Tylee. But here's the thing. If Chad was so innocent, and he's innocent until proven guilty, but if he didn't know what was going on, who started all the bonfires? And by the pet cemetery, I'd kind of like to know that. And John said that there are pieces that were missing of Tylee. So I can just imagine what the jurors are thinking. If they think day 1 is horrible, which is true, it is with these details, wait until they get the pictures of the evidence of all 3 victims. And there were a lot of sidebars today. Like, it was a lot of sidebars from John Pryor. And this is where we bring in the first witness, Detective Hermosillo. And Detective Hermosillo is the one who went to the welfare check in November of 2019 looking for a Jeep that belonged to Charles Vallow. But Tylee drove it. And they were investigating this Jeep in regards to the attempt on Brandon Boudreau's life. He got shot at. But what they found at the time was they were also asked to do a welfare check on JJ. So that would have been the end of November, and they talked about that welfare check. Now, Detective Hermosillo talked about making contact with Alex during this welfare check and asked if Lori was home and if JJ was home. And at that point, the detective said that Alex looked frightened and looked at Chad, who was also there and who initially never answered the question, and asked again if JJ was home. And Alex said that JJ was with grandma in Louisiana, who would be Kay Woodcock. And the detective was getting a little bit concerned, because the way they were both acting. And also, the detective said, well, that can't be, because she's the one who called in the welfare check. And he said at that point, Alex looked over and at Chad as well, and they both looked at each other, and he said it just was really odd. And at that point, the detective asked Alex where he can find Lori. Detective Hermosillo knew already that Alex and Lori were extremely close, but Alex was said to have not had her number. So detective goes to the apartment 107, which is supposedly Alex's, and there was no answer, and he wanted to figure out what's going on because of the deception. So he called in more detectives. As he said, he was parked in the alleyway as he was waiting for them when he saw Chad driving in a black Chevy Equinox trying to leave. And we know Chad likes to flee, even though John Pryor says no. But the detective stopped him to have a conversation and asked how he knew Lori. And he said he didn't know her very well and saw her only a handful of times. But through the investigation, the detective already knew that they were married 2 weeks before that. So it was interesting, and he said that Chad felt like he was being accused of something, but the detective said, well, I was just asking where the whereabouts of JJ was and for the wife's phone number. Then they talked about the day after that going and getting a search warrant, and they searched apartment number 175, which is Lori's, 174, which was Melanie's, she lived right next door, and 107, which was Alex's. And he said there was a few things that stuck out to them. Number one, in Lori's garage, there was a bunch of guns, ammo, knives, and suppressors in that garage. There was also a Star Wars suitcase, and he said that all the clothes were also off the hangers, which was very peculiar. He said that was really odd. And when he went to number 174, which was Melanie Pulowski / Boudreaux, they said that they found a lot of money in there, and quite a bit of money. And then they also went to 107, which was vacant at the time. When they did talk to Lori, it was interesting because she's the one who said JJ's with her friend in Arizona, which would be Melanie Gibb. And she said that they're going to see a Frozen 2 movie, which I've said this before that bothers me, is that both JJ and Tylee at that time were already dead and underground. And it's November, end of November, and they would both be frozen. It's not the first time they did a play on words. Like I said earlier about Chad Daybell, he likes to do that as well. He did that in the Charles Vallow case series that I did, where Chad phoned to find out about the cost to have the cremains shipped, as he called it. He pretended to be Charles's uncle, and he said that his name was Chad Daybell, and he wanted a ballpark figure. And we know that there was a bat involved when Charles died, and also that Charles had history of being a pro ball player. So there's all kinds of things in there. And there's also a note that I believe was coded. I'll put that at the end of this video, or probably down below, so you could take a look at it. And I think it was a coded message, basically asking Chad if he could come and be part of the festivities in, let's just say, with Charles being killed, and using those play on words, like they have a habit of doing. John Pryor made so many objections, though, today while Detective Hermosillo was on the stand. It was out of hand. But again, he's trying to fight for Chad, so I understand that. I see what he's trying to do, but it is annoying. But I think he's just warming up, and I think this is nothing yet. I swear, I don't know, 20 objections. I don't know how many today. I should have actually counted. But one specifically that was particularly annoying was the prosecution were talking about pictures of the apartment of Lori to Detective Hermosillo, and John kept asking, 4 or 5 times, about who the photographer is that was taking the pictures or what their name was. And he kept saying, why is it that you don't know the name of the photographer and you can't tell me the name of the photographer and what that was? And it just kept going on and on. He's like, so you mean to tell me that you don't know who that was? He has already asked and answered it, but there was quite a few of those today. So like I said, just getting started. And now when it came to the guns in the garage, he also talked about how the detective took the stuff out to lay it out to take pictures. And the detective said, he's just taking things out and photographing things that are of evidentiary value. But for John, he's like, okay, so you didn't take all this stuff out of the garage and photograph it all then? You just did that then? One of the things I was thinking about the jurors at this point was because the detective started talking about Brandon Boudreau, Melanie Pawlowski, Colby Ryan. These are the people that, are closely involved in ways of being, either close family or involved. And I mean, remember when the jurors, they don't really know a whole lot, right? They don't know about the case, or they shouldn't. And so it's a case that's already convoluted. So I wonder if they're lost at this point, or if they're keeping up okay, or if everything okay, just need a little, need a little help. I wonder. Prosecution talked a little bit about Hawaii, and that Detective Hermosillo was there asking for assistance in there because the kids were announced missing, and Lori had 5 days to produce them. And so there was warrants for that. And when they were in Hawaii, the detective said that it just looked like there was 2 adults living there. There was 2 towels, 2 of everything. Everything was in pairs. There was no sign of JJ, no sign of Tylee. And then they moved on to talk about the day that the kids were found. They didn't finish it off today, but they were talking about it this afternoon. And that it was the morning that the kids was found on June 9th, 2020. It was around 7 a.m. and they went to go serve it to Chad, but Chad was still sleeping. He asked if it was okay if he got dressed and then come out. So they gave him the search warrant, and he said, do I need to stay? Do I need to leave? And Detective Hermosillo said, you're fine to stay. Somebody will be sitting with you. But Chad wanted to make a phone call. So he went and made the phone call. We later knew that it was Lori. They didn't talk about that today, but he made the phone call. And the detective was watching him and noticed that he kept looking over his shoulder at a certain spot, and he wanted to see what that was all about. And Chad was looking at the pet cemetery, and he was watching that the kids were being dug up. And then it was said, I don't think they said it today, but basically that Chad took off. Can't remember if they said that today or if I was just reviewing that, but Chad did take off at a high rate of speed, and then they had to go catch up to him, and he got arrested. So Detective Hermosillo started in talking about JJ and how he was being uncovered, and that they first saw white rocks and then went below the rock to the boards. Those were removed, and they saw discoloration and also a decomposition smell. And they said under the boards were wet and moist, and they said it was pretty obvious what was there. He said, about decomposition. And he said it was a smell that you can't forget. And he said that they went down and they just thought it was a round object. But then there was a slit that they made in the black plastic, and then another slit that they made in the next layer, which was a white layer of plastic under that. And then they found human hair, and says that a small body was wrapped in black plastic with duct tape around it, and that's where they stopped. Court actually ended at 3:30 on time today. And now, so tomorrow they're actually doing court again. They're going to do day 2, but on Friday they are not. I was kind of hoping that they would have tomorrow off. I was putting it out there, the good juju, because tomorrow's my birthday. So I kind of wanted the day off, but I will be doing a live stream in the morning. I may dabble and take a little break here and there, but we're going to be in there. We're going to probably see Detective Hermosillo take the stand again. He'll walk us through JJ. He'll walk us through Tylee, I'm sure. And then we'll see what ends up happening and who else is on the witness stand. It starts at 8:30 tomorrow morning. I will put the live stream up. Be sure to go check that. If you want to know more about the apartments, I did a video way back called something about Alex Cox and apartment 107. It's very interesting because I had wondered why Lori chose the apartment she did and not the one that she ended up with. Check that out right here. And here you can check out another one on the case about Lori's flights and all the flights she took with good old Melanie Pulowski. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in day 2.